Okay. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this special event at the State Library, a conversation between two great Australian political commentators, La Trobe's Professor Robert Manne and the Project's Waleed Aly, on the topic of the rise of ISIS and Islamist extremism and questions of how the Muslim Australian community is faring in this country at this time. My name's Gwenda Tavan and I'm the Head of Politics and Philosophy at La Trobe University. I would like to begin these proceedings today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the original custodians of this land upon which we meet, and to pay my respects to their Aboriginal elders, both past and present. This event has been organised as part of La Trobe's Bold Thinking series in conjunction with La Trobe's Ideas and Society program, a forum which frequently brings together prominent speakers to discuss current issues facing our community. Our host today is Emeritus Professor Robert Manne, who is also a La Trobe Vice-Chancellor's Fellow and convener of the La Trobe Ideas and Society program. One of Australia's leading public intellectuals, Professor Manne has published many essays, books and edited volumes over the course of his career, and has contributed regularly both in print media and broadcasting on Australian and international public affairs. Our guest, Waleed Aly, is a broadcaster, academic, lawyer, author, musician, and one of Australia's most respected media talents. Having previously worked as a commercial lawyer with experience also in human rights and family law, he's now a lecturer in politics at Monash University, working with its Global Terrorism Research Centre. As a spokesman for the Islamic Council of Victoria, he frequently comments on Australian Muslim matters in the public realm. Aly's media roles are varied, to say the least. He is co-host of Network 10's The Project, which airs 5 nights a week. He presents The Minefield on ABC Radio National every Thursday morning. He has provided sporting analysis on ABC News 24's The Drum and political analysis on programs like Q&A and BBC World. At the same time, his social and political commentary appears regularly in newspapers like The Australian Financial Review and the Sydney Morning Herald. There are many more things I could say about Waleed's career, but there isn't enough time. Suffice to say that his versatility, his intellect and passionate commitment to human rights and social justice have made him one of Australia's most respected and trusted public intellectuals. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to begin proceedings very shortly, but first of all, we'd like to start with a short video. Please wait. Thank you.
When news broke that more than 130 people had been murdered in Paris, this is how ISIL responded.
A group of believers from the soldiers of the Caliphate set out targeting the capital of prostitution and vice, the lead carrier of the cross in Europe, Paris.
And really, there's no doubt that this was an Islamist terrorist attack, probably executed under ISIL's flag. What we don't know yet is if the attack was planned, ordered or funded by ISIL's leaders in Syria, because the problem is, this is what ISIL do. They take credit for any act of terrorism on Western soil so that they appear bigger and tougher than they actually are. They did the same thing last year with the shooting at Canada's Parliament, and when a bloke ran around New York with a hatchet attacking people, and again with the Sydney siege.
There has been some suggestion that is an ISIS flag.
ISIL didn't control these guys. They were DIY terrorists who recruited themselves, but ISIL don't want you to know that. How do I know? Because ISIL told us they don't want you to know that in their monthly magazine. In October last year, they wrote this: "It is important that the killing becomes attributed to patrons of the Islamic State who have obeyed its leadership. This can easily be done with anonymity. Otherwise, Crusader media makes such attacks appear to be random killings."
Every time an attack happens, and they do claim it, they're headline news around the world.
There's a reason ISIL want to appear so powerful, why they don't want to acknowledge that the land they control has been taken from weak enemies, that they're pinned down by airstrikes, or that just last weekend they lost a significant part of their territory.
They really don't have the capacity to hit back against the combat aircraft of the West.
ISIL don't want you to know they would quickly be crushed if they ever faced a proper army on a real battlefield. They want you to fear them. They want you to get angry. They want all of us to become hostile, and here's why. ISIL's strategy is to split the world into two camps. It's that black and white. Again, we know this because they told us. Last year, they declared there is no grey zone in this crusade against the Islamic State. The world has split into two encampments, one for the people of faith, the other for the people of disbelief, all in preparation for the final Great War. They want to start World War III, a global war between Muslims and everyone else. That's what they want to create. They want societies like France and here in Australia to turn on each other.
We as a society, as a community, need to be very mindful of maintaining and protecting our social cohesion, our sense of harmony, and standing together.
They want countries like ours to reject their Muslims and vilify them.
We need to look at the teachings of the Quran. It is about, killing and beheading the non-believers.
ISIL's leaders would be ecstatic to hear that since the atrocity in Paris, Muslims have reportedly been threatened and attacked in England, America, and here in Australia. Because this evil organisation has it in their heads that if they can make Muslims the enemy of the West, then Muslims in France and England and America and here in Australia will have nowhere to turn but to ISIL. That was exactly their strategy in Iraq, and now they want it to go global. Saying that out loud, it's both dumbfounding in its stupidity and blood-curdling in its barbarity. We're all feeling a million raging emotions right now. I am angry at these terrorists. I'm sickened by the violence, and I'm crushed for the families that have been left behind. But you know what? I won't be manipulated. We all need to come together. I know how that sounds. I know it's a cliche, but it's also true because it's exactly what ISIL doesn't want. So if you're a member of parliament or a has-been member of parliament preaching hate at a time when what we actually need is more love, you're helping ISIL. They have told us that. If you're a Muslim leader telling your community they have no place here, or a non-Muslim basically saying the same thing, you're helping ISIL. They have told us that. Or if you're just someone with a Facebook or Twitter account firing off misguided missives of hate, you're helping ISIL. They've told us that. And I'm pretty sure that right now, none of us wants to help these bastards.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Manne and Waleed Aly. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Particularly, I'd like
some water?
Yes, thank you. I was very keen to begin today's event with that clip because I feel that Australia is extremely fortunate to have a communicator as gifted as Waleed Aly, who I think is now playing a really very significant role in making Australia a more humane place. So I'd really like to welcome you with great sincerity. Thank you very much. I know how busy you are, but for making the time to come.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about the issue of Islamic State, but also and its impact in Europe, America, but also I'd like to end by talking about its impact, or the impact of these kinds of events on the Muslim community in Australia. So I'll begin with this question. And I suppose in a way I'm addressing you now partly as a commentator and partly as a Muslim. I think there's something quite unprecedented, at least in contemporary times, that the movement Al-Qaeda and its successor really, Islamic State, claim that even though they are an extreme, radical, and I agree with you, evil ideology, they claim to be speaking as the authentic voice for Islam or for your religion. I'd just like you to comment in a way on what can be done about that. How can that argument best be countered?
Little can be done about it because kind of the way that Islam is set up is that it's not set up. So there's no organisation, there's no one in charge. Right? We don't have a pope. And so that has amazing benefits, by the way. I mean, what that means is that speech within the Islamic tradition is constantly open. Issues are very rarely, if ever, settled finally. There's always a sort of constant, quite thoroughgoing debate about things, which has benefited Islamic history tremendously. But it has a disadvantage, and that is you can't shut people up, and you can't, there's no sort of official, theologically convincing form of excommunication that someone can just unroll. Right? There's no one to stand up and say, sorry, you're not in the club anymore. It just doesn't work that way. So there's no real way of stopping people saying things, making claims, potentially even making them violently. All there really is that's left over is the contest of ideas. But here I think we need to be really careful not to overstate. That's a really important contest, but it's not the only contest. In some ways, it's not really about ideas. It's about emotion and identity. So if you look, for example, at the people who become really attracted to an organisation like ISIS, you are not talking about people who have reached this point after 30 years of theological reflection in some seminary or other. That's not who these people are. They typically have very, very shallow experiences of religion, very shallow religious commitments, in that, when I say shallow, I mean 6 months ago they were not religious at all. Like, it had not even entered their minds. It's a much, much rarer story to find someone who grew up in a religious family, was given religious education from a young age, sort of grew up with that, who then ends up in one of these groups. That's really, really rare, particularly in the West. There are some exceptions to that. Perhaps the most famous exception to that, which is not an ISIS exception, but previous to that, was bin Laden.
Yeah.
So he's rare in that respect, in that he was kind of religious from a young age. But as far as the people who are being sucked into this movement are concerned, they're not theologically minded people, typically. Even the organisation in Syria and Iraq itself is a real mix. Like, we often overlook, we think of it just as an outgrowth of Al-Qaeda, and sort of that's true, but it's also got a massive chunk of Saddam Hussein's old machinery.
Yes.
That we didn't, when we invaded, we sort of excluded from the reconstruction of the Iraqi state, and they kind of had nowhere to go. And they meet Baghdadi in prison in 2010, I think it was, when he was in prison, and they sort of come up with this alliance. So a lot of them are Baathists or ex-Baathists who are avowedly nationalist, secular political movement, right? So trying to understand ISIS in sort of narrowly ideological terms, I think, can be really misleading for that reason. And trying to understand their appeal as being the consequence of a religious argument, one side of which is winning or losing at any particular moment, I think is also misleading, because there are so many social and identity-driven determinants of what makes them attractive that we can really easily gloss over if that's the approach we take.
Nevertheless, can I?
Yeah.
I privately all my life have been interested in ideology, and I've become interested in the ideological aspects, even though I agree with you. Olivier Roy in France has made the case, as well as you, about the kind of people that are attracted to ISIS and the Islamic State. But on the ideology, a term that I think is now used is Salafi jihadist as a description of the kind of tiny corner of this vast world of Islam. Do you agree with that term, firstly, as a way of describing the ideological content of IS? Do you agree?
Yeah, okay. Not entirely. I see where people are going with it, in that if you were to perform some kind of discourse analysis of Al-Qaeda and then ISIS, there are very clear, it's clearly a jihadist organisation, although my colleague Pete Lentini would object to that, and he would say neo-jihadist is actually a better description, and there are technical reasons for that, mainly to do with the fact that when jihadism emerged from the Middle East, it was really about violence against conventional militaries. And neo-jihadism completely changed that by directing that violence to civilians, and they're actually quite different ideas. So that would be his argument. So with that caveat, I'm prepared to say, okay, the jihadism is clear. The Salafism is clear as well in, like, when you read...
Perhaps you could explain to the audience what Salafism means.
I'll do that in a sec, because that's a really complicated point. So let me just say as an ambit claim, the Salafism is clear, but there's other stuff in there as well. Right? And if you look, for example, at the discourse of bin Laden, he's clearly inspired by a figure like Sayyid Qutb, who was not a Salafi, really. He was sort of an outgrowth of the Ikhwani movement, or the Brotherhood movement. The Brotherhood rejected him in the end, but he was an outgrowth of that. As for what Salafism is, this is really complicated. So,
but you're a great simplifier.
Although, yeah, all right. I will simplify grandly. How about that? Salafism effectively, to put it in really inappropriate analogical terms, it's basically a form of Protestantism. So think about it this way. The Islamic tradition was something that grew up over, I guess, 1,400 years of scholarly interaction. And there were all kinds of movements and currents and countercurrents within that. But it was a tradition. And so when you learnt Islamic theology or jurisprudence or whatever it might be, Quranic interpretation, you weren't just dealing with text, you were dealing with an accumulated community of interpretation, right? And different communities of interpretation and the dialogues between them, and you were learning a really sort of vast ocean of discourse. What the Salafis effectively came along and said was that tradition is of limited value, and it has led us away from the pure meaning of the text in certain cases. And the seminal scholar in this regard is a guy by the name of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, which is why sometimes you hear Salafis referred to as Wahhabis, but there's a difference. And he was particularly concerned with what he saw, forms of folk religious practice that he thought involved idolatry, right? So grave worship or things like that. And he thought that needed to be purified. And so he ran a very strong argument that said, we need to get back to text, and text is kind of all there is. At the same time, a similar argument was being run in Egypt, in the post-colonial environment, which was actually saying that the religious institutions of knowledge in Egypt had kind of collapsed and had sort of become a little bit superstitious and not open enough to modern ideas contained in science or Western philosophy and so on. And this was all part of the modernist movement. But that itself was also a Salafi movement, because in trying to free themselves from these accumulated interpretations over millennia, they said what we need to do is rethink things and go back to the text. So these are all Salafi movements. But when we talk in the context of this, what we're really referring to is the more hard-edged stuff that came out of the Wahhabi side of that Salafi movement. And really what it was about just going back to Scripture with nothing else. Now, the problem with that is that Scripture means nothing without a methodology to interpret it. And this is one of the great crises of the modern Muslim world, is that it's all Scripture, no methodology. So there's no coherence, and that's why I object to people describing these people as literalists, because they're not. Like, literalism is really interesting. There was a very interesting literalist movement in Moorish Spain, a whole school of thought called the Zahiri school, for those playing along at home, and they were hyper-literalist, so literalist. One of them, Ibn Hazm, who's a very celebrated scholar within this school, held that it was permissible for Muslims to eat crackling, for example. So pig fat and pig skin.
Because that hadn't been...
The Quran only prohibits the consumption of lahm, or flesh. Right? So that's how literalist he was.
Yeah.
And they had a whole school like that. It was just very, very... And they're a really interesting school, but they are a million miles away from these guys. So these guys are actually really selectively literalist. I mean, if you want to be really literalist, they should be fighting wars on horseback with swords, but they're not. Right? And they will violate very clear rules of military engagement. One of those rules being warfare, particularly if it's offensive, has to be done, it's a state function, not a function of sort of a more vigilante group. So that's one thing. But even little things like the use of fire in punishment. Like there was a classic, that really well-known horrific case where ISIS burned alive the Jordanian pilot. The first thing that I thought of when I saw that, I mean, there is a very specific statement that the Prophet makes where he says, never punish by fire. Whatever punishment you are going to dream up, it shouldn't involve fire. And there they are. So there's no literalism in this. It's a really very selective...
You know how they answer... I've read Dabiq, which is their magazine. They answer that by saying there's another part of the Quran which says you will meet your enemies by doing the things they do to you. So that is meant to trump the...
But this is really interesting, right? Because what that... And Bin Laden ran a similar sort of argument, right? Like the logic of 9/11, by the way, for those who have not heard this before, was Western forces led by the United States, or what they would call the Crusader Zionist Alliance, have killed X number of Muslim civilians. So I can't remember what the figure they got up to was. Let's say it was 3 million. We've now killed 3,000. We've got a long way to go before we reach equality. Right? That was kind of the argument. It's almost a numerical, or no, literally a numerical argument. Well, I guess they would stop killing civilians once they'd reached the quota. I don't know, but that's the implication of what they're saying.
So long as the Americans had stopped killing them.
Unless the numbers keep, But the argument, fight them as they fight you. So we will do whatever has been done to us. Now, the thing is, that is a really novel interpretation in Islamic history, right? It's not really literalist because you've got these other far more explicit on-point texts that are literally telling you this specifically you cannot do. But more importantly, I think this fleshes out the nature of these sort of groups really well. Really what that amounts to is a kind of nihilism. There are no real moral standards. There are no no-go zones, really. All it is a matter of aping whatever is coming at you. And that allows you to have your moral standards set by somebody else. And I don't know any theorist of classical Islamic, or any classical Islamic theorist of warfare that would go anywhere near that.
And within your faith, what do you think have been the most important critiques made of the distortion of the faith that is represented by first Al-Qaeda, then ISIS?
Important in what sense, I suppose, is the question?
That have had effect, that have had influence.
Well, I mean, there are lots of things you can point to. So, for example, there was a massive, like a great big tome. It was like a point-by-point refutation of everything ISIS had said, written by a huge committee of Muslim scholars from around the world. And it didn't seem to get much attention, certainly not in media. But it's a fairly substantial body of work with a really diverse range of scholars. Now, was that influential? I suppose, but the question is, with whom? I could point alternatively to an argument that, or not an argument, just a movement that I would probably describe as the fastest growing movement within Muslim communities, particularly in the West, which I describe as a kind of neo-traditionalist movement. But I haven't really nailed down my terms to give you a really precise definition of that. But this is kind of led by people, like in the United States, a really, really famous scholar by the name of Hamza Yusuf, he's a bit of a rock star. Like if you chuck him into YouTube, you'll probably get 3 million videos. He's very popular, very widely disseminated. He's very charismatic. He's a white American of Greek background who converted to Islam when he was a kid and speaks flawless Arabic and studied traditionally at the feet of scholars in Mauritania under a tree in the desert. And that's not a caricature, that's literally what he did. That sort of guy. And he's incredibly charismatic, very popular. And he's probably the most influential Muslim scholar in the world today, but you probably haven't heard much about him, right? Because beyond the Muslim community, it's not really, you know. But he gave a really, really interesting sermon just in a mosque on a Friday one day, because he's in California, that's where he's based, in the Bay Area. And he gave this sermon that was all about how ISIS is the fulfillment of all of these prophecies, and they fulfill all the signs that we were given of people who were condemned. And it was one of the most amazing things I've seen, because even though I wasn't familiar with the literature he was quoting, it was just like a checklist of things. Now, that's the most powerful message you could send, because this is arguing entirely from within an Islamic framework that these guys stand condemned of themselves. Even little, tiny little things, like one of the signs of this group that would emerge was that they would refer to everybody by a nickname that is by the father of somebody, right? So Abu someone that'd be all their names. And this is an astonishing thing, because if you look at ISIS, everyone involved has one of these. I don't even know if they actually have kids necessarily when they're given these names, but they're all given them, right? So you have people like, what was his name? Abu Khalid al-Kambodi, for example, who's the Australian guy, Neil Prakash, who I think died recently. Like, you go through, everyone has one of these things. Now, this is a tiny little detail in some obscure text somewhere, but this guy, because he's, you know, an actual scholar and he knows all of this stuff really well, can just pluck all this stuff out. And it's riveting watching, whether you buy it or not. It's riveting to watch. But the problem is that none of that stuff, I mean, it's not going to solve the problem, right? Because who's he talking to? Well, he's talking to people who are religiously engaged. And he's talking to people who have a real religious interest. But as I've kind of said before, a lot of the people who end up being swept up in sort of the ISIS vortex are people who were not religiously interested 5 minutes ago.
Yes.
So they're not going to be influenced by that stuff, because it's not in their universe until the moment they get sucked into this movement. It just doesn't work that way.
I mean, I've called you what I believe to be a great communicator, and I want to anchor this discussion in something very local and very real, which is all the time one hears people like Andrew Bolt or Alan Jones, scores and scores of others, who have in a way taken Al-Qaeda and ISIS at face value by suggesting this is what Islam really is. How do you, you've now got a really big audience, the project. How do you begin to break, I mean, I think you've said enough for everyone now to know how much you know about your faith and the tradition of Islam. How do you break through what is really, it seems to me, as an outsider to all of this, a central problem, which is the idea that what is happening in Islamic State is somehow a faithful representation of one of the world's great religions. So I'm asking you as a communicator how
I do that. Well, but the thing is, I don't.
Well, you did.
Well, did I? Because after that, it was the same old stuff, right?
Oh, not in one blow.
Well, no, but it was. Like, I had, so I don't know, because I don't actually pay attention. I don't listen to Sheikh Alan Jones very much. But, so I don't really know what they're saying, but it sort of gets back to me. And, like, apparently there were responses to that, basically saying how that was denying the real problem and all that. Okay, well, there comes a point where the ignorance is so determined and so insincere that I just have no desire or energy to engage it. Like, I just don't, because it's not going to convince anybody.
But isn't your audience young people who are not rusted on to Andrew Bolt?
Yeah, but I actually think there are very few people listening to that stuff who aren't rusted on. I mean, I think if those sort of voices were even half as relevant as they thought they were, we would be living in a very, very different country. There wouldn't be a Labor government in any jurisdiction in the country. Tony Abbott would be the most popular Prime Minister in history, and he would still be in power. And I would not have a job. None of those things are true.
Yeah.
Therefore, these voices are far more irrelevant than they're often given credit for. That's my logical syllogism. You can break it down if you like, but that's kind of how I feel about it. Oh no, don't clap. This isn't Oprah. You don't need to do that. So, you know, I actually think a lot of these things are really irrelevant and marginal. That said, I mean, there is a real problem in that. I think a lot of lay people have that general impression. It's sort of like, well, ISIS, I guess they're the guys, right? And some of that comes from politicians who, what was it, Andrew Hastie, who one day sat down and watched 60 videos and declared that he'd figured out that this was all about scripture. I was like, okay, well, that's one way to sort of perform exegesis. But you know, so you do occasionally get those sort of things. You get the sort of Tony Abbott, there needs to be a Reformation sort of concept. You get, even someone like Josh Frydenberg jumped on that. So you get that sort of energy going. But those sort of things are very hard to respond to with details about Islamic scripture, because I don't think those positions really come from that. I don't think they come from someone sitting down, doing their very best to discern what the sum total of the Islamic interpretive tradition is and what the Quran says here and what the different Quranic interpreters over history have said about that verse. And they're not doing that, right? In the same way that the people who sign up to ISIS, whether literally or just in a symbolic way from a distance, in the same way that they are really just hitching themselves to something that feels good. There's an identity movement at play. I think the opposite impulse is the same. If I can just pin this on one sort of big colossal evil that removes all of the human and social dynamics from consideration and just says, here we go, here's the problem, it's this thing called Islam, maybe you haven't heard about it, I'm here to tell you all about it, right? If you can do that, that feels great. And it renders a complex thing simple. What's tricky about it is I'm not sure what solutions it yields, other than, I don't know, mass forced conversion or genocide or some other form of ethnic cleansing. The solution's never fully articulated. But I think the reason people have that sort of commitment or that sort of worldview is because it supports the identity they're crafting and it supports the worldview that they have more broadly. That's not about terrorism necessarily.
Can we go on to terrorism?
Sure. Were we not?
Well, I want to ask something more specific. I mean, whatever one thinks about Al-Qaeda, they did have one moment, a history-making impact, which was 9/11. Yep. And I'm interested in a way and the response of the United States to that attack was firstly to attack and invade then Afghanistan, and then for reasons that I've never been able to understand, and even people who don't know a lot more than I do can't understand the decision to invade Iraq.
I'll explain that later. Sorry.
I asked David Kilcullen this question, and he said it was he thought a form of hypnosis that happened. He knew these people. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, in a way from the point of view of Muslims, and obviously yourself, what impact do you think the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq have had in the world?
Well, Iraq a much more significant impact than Afghanistan, I think. Partly because Afghanistan, whether you agree with the war or not, there was at least a coherent, defensible narrative you could tell about it.
That they were providing sanctuary for Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Now, I think that was still a simplistic understanding of the problem, and so it has proven since, because what happens in Afghanistan is we go in and we smash Al-Qaeda's infrastructure, great, and then terrorism increases. Yeah? We were out there to get bin Laden, that was the thing, he was the guy. We get him, the CEO of terror, and then Terror Inc. will end, right? So we get him, and we kill him, and then terrorism goes up. So there's clearly a misdiagnosis going on within this, right? But Iraq was the real problem in so many ways. One, it created the instability, and not just Iraq. When I say Iraq, I don't just mean the invasion, I mean then the handling post-invasion of the reconstruction of the country. Because those two things, I think they're actually inseparable. But what's happened is, I mean, the instability that created, the complete alienation of the old regimes, so that you had all these Baathists who were really capable of doing some pretty nasty stuff just at a loose end, which ends up expressing itself in the form of ISIS. I mean, there's that on one level. Then there's the radicalising effect of Iraq. So what you will often hear in this concept of, you know, does Iraq or did the Iraq war inspire more terrorism, or is it a root cause of terrorism? What you will hear is, well, there was terrorism before Iraq. 9/11 happened before Iraq. We were attacked before Iraq, Bali, etc. And that's true. Iraq did not create the phenomenon of terrorism. But what it did do was give greater momentum to the engine of radicalisation. And that expressed itself in the form of homegrown attacks in Western societies. That we hadn't seen before. 9/11 was not a homegrown attack, right? Which is why I think in some ways the London bombings are actually the more significant attack, because that's the one where our whole understanding of the phenomenon of terrorism changed. 9/11 was spectacular and it was cinematic and it was really confronting in that way, but it was in a bizarre way comprehensible because it was still foreigners that did it.
Yeah.
Right? So it was still like an external attack. London changed all that. So all of that, and Mark Sageman goes through this in a lot of detail, he's come up with his own theories for where this terrorism comes from, and he describes it as the group of guys theory, which is the best academic name I've ever heard for anything. But he observes that all of these attacks happen post-invasion, particularly the self-starting ones he's interested in. So not ones where you've got someone in Al-Qaeda funding someone to go out and do something and hatching a plan, which Al-Qaeda does very little of, by the way. Well, not very, but quite little. He's talking about attacks where the people involved had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, really. They didn't necessarily even have training. It's just it's DIY terrorism. And there's a whole spate of them. And beginning really with Madrid, which was a massive attack and nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And we thought London was an example. It turned out there was an Al-Qaeda connection to that, but at the time we didn't think that. But there's this massive spate of them. And Sageman identifies all of them, he lists them, and he says they all begin from 2004, and everyone involved cites the Iraq War as a major reason. Now, you don't have to take these people at their word, but there is a really important sociological correlation going on. I had an interesting experience last year when a very senior member of the Howard, or public servant who was, you couldn't be more senior in the Howard government than he was, and I asked him a question, which is, do you take any personal responsibility because of the invasion of Iraq, in which the Howard government was involved, for the fact that the Islamic State is now in control of considerable areas of Iraq and Syria? Not only did he not answer me, but he went purple with rage, as if it was a kind of improper question. I wanted to ask you whether you accept my view. You want me to go purple with rage?
No, I want you to agree with me. To accept my view that without the American invasion or the Allied invasion with Britain and Australia along, it's inconceivable that IS would now be in control of parts of the territory of Iraq and Syria.
Yeah, I think that's true, but it's not the full story. I think ISIS, in the form we now see it, doesn't exist without the disaster in Syria, which is
nothing to do with
a function of the Iraq War. You could argue, and I haven't got to the bottom of this myself, but you could argue that actually had more to do with Western non-intervention than intervention. But there's no doubt that, and this is just a matter of historical record, it's not even opinion, it's just fact, that the groups that accumulated to become ISIS were groups that were created in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq. I mean, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was never really part of it was part of Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda didn't like them very much.
No, but Zarqawi had very bad relations with Osama bin Laden.
Zawahiri, bin Laden didn't like what he was doing. Zawahiri didn't like what Zarqawi was doing because he was killing a lot of Shia, and that was kind of his main focus. Anyway, that's all by the by. There's this letter from Zawahiri to Zarqawi that's entertaining reading, if nothing else, which you can probably find on Google. But they were really not the same thing. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq only arrives because of the invasion. The ousting of, as I say, the Ba'athist operatives from the Saddam Hussein regime, that only obviously is a function of Iraq, the invasion of Iraq. These people meeting in prison, those sort of other insurgency groups coming together, the insurgency groups had to exist for that to happen, and the insurgency groups existed because of the invasion of Iraq. Like, it's just obvious. Yeah. And Tony Blair's admitted this.
So you do agree with me?
Well, I agree with that, yeah. But what I'm not necessarily saying, and what I don't think is true, although I haven't really concluded on it, is that the invasion of Iraq alone is enough to bring ISIS into existence. Oh, no. I don't think that necessarily would have happened. And I think the Arab uprisings and then Bashar al-Assad's response to them, and I don't think people have figured this out, or like analysts do all the time, it's a sort of a well-known thing, but ISIS exists because Bashar al-Assad wanted them to exist. He was very happy for them to exist.
Yeah, I mean, one theory is he wanted something worse than him in order to...
Well, but he said, because remember when all the uprisings happened, he said, you can't trust these protesters, they're all terrorists.
Yeah.
And they weren't, so he set about making sure that eventually they were, right?
It was something that he could put his finger on.
It's amazing. I've spoken to people in government, our government and other governments who work in this area, and the stories they will tell about are incredible, like how certain facilities would be controlled by ISIS, and the Assad regime just looks at it and goes, okay, fine, just playing wide of it. And then the minute, like, the Free Syrian Army got hold of that same institution, it bombed instantly, right? They knew who they cared about fighting, and they knew who they were quite happy to nurture. And so ISIS didn't really attack Assad, and Assad didn't really attack ISIS, and that's how they've got this foothold in Syria. And that's crucial to the ISIS story. So the war in Iraq is not sufficient, but I think it was necessary. Yeah.
Good. You sort of agree. Two other big questions before I want to move to contemporary Europe, contemporary America, but also spend quite a bit of time on the position of Muslims in Australia. But two final big questions about IS, as I call it now, right. Islamic State.
It's like the war on terror, and then there's the war over what to call the people in the war on terror. It's amazing.
That's probably going to be nastier.
Yeah, it probably is.
The first big question, I'm sure everyone here is puzzled and wants an answer to this question. How would you explain the extreme barbarity of Islamic State, not only the beheadings, but putting them on video, trying to show the world beheadings, the desecration of old monuments, the return of sexual slavery, and the genocide of, say, Shiites, but also Yazidi, which fit the classic definition of the UN's definition of genocide. How is this extreme barbarity, do you think, best explained, or is it inexplicable?
No, I don't think it's inexplicable. I don't actually think it's hard to explain. What is ISIS? And I mean, that's the beginning of understanding it. And for me, it's pretty clear what it is. It's a state-building enterprise. That's David Kilcullen's term for it. And it's effectively become a state. But in its genesis, that's what it was trying to do. It's trying to build a state, and then it grabs territory.
The caliphate.
And then, and then it tries to establish its authority over that territory. So the violence, particularly the really graphic violence, is, for me, it has to be understood through the prism of them trying to build their state. And there are lots of precedents in history for that. So I often will describe it, if I'm writing about it, I'll often describe their violence as Jacobin. I since got an email from a historian of the French Revolution who got angry with me about that because he thinks the Jacobins are very misunderstood, which is fine. He did admit that his is not a universally accepted view, but it was an interesting exchange. I just thought I'd reference it, just so you can't say I didn't consult the literature. I mean, Jacobin violence, the idea of Jacobin violence is a really simple one. You, as a state or a fledgling state, trying to establish your authority by intimidating the population into acquiescence through the most graphic public depictions of violence that you can think of for anybody who does not match either who you want in the state or who is resisting. It's kind of that simple. That's only part of the violence, right? So the stuff that's going on internally, the genocides, the beheadings, not of Westerners, but of Shia and other people, that's what that is. It's a campaign of intimidation to establish state authority. And so it's actually quite a different thing to what we would classically think of as terrorism. Because terrorism is typically non-state actor trying to attack a state actor, either to get them to change a policy or to replace them or something like that. This is a group of people who are in control of territory, trying to establish their rule over that territory. So they're just borrowing from a very old playbook in that respect. Yes. The other stuff, though, so the execution of Western targets, particularly with beheading and so on, that I think does operate more in a mode of classic terrorism, where what you are trying to do is scandalise and radicalise the whole terrain. And the beheadings particularly are not new for this group, because if you believe, well, we know that ISIS grew out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is Zarqawi led. And Zarqawi was a big fan of this. You might remember, I don't know if you do remember, but around 2004 there was that spate of beheadings that happened. It was very short-lived. Yes. Where they would just take hostages and behead them on like aid workers and all sorts of people. And it was very short-lived, partly because the response was such repulsion. And Al-Qaeda were really angry about it.
It's one of the things Zawahiri has against.
Yes, so Zawahiri fires off his letter to Zarqawi partly about this, saying, everyone's recoiling at this. We're losing the people. We're losing the masses.
Hearts and minds.
It is a hearts and minds strategy. In some ways, this is the problem, is that Al-Qaeda's hearts and minds strategy was more evolved than ours, right? But anyway, that was really short-lived. So we knew Zarqawi liked doing this sort of thing, right? And so the movement that's grown out of that has really just carried that on. But what they've found is that by doing that, they ensure a huge amount of Western attention. They probably provoke a Western military response. If they can provoke that and it's not calibrated very well, then they get more and more recruits. And that, again, is a very old terrorism strategy, right? You provoke an overreaction so that you can swell your ranks. Really old, really, really common. It's, again, from a very old playbook. So they're doing that. And then also, there's a secondary message being sent out, which is one of might and strength and power, and also unaccountability before the rest of the world. And this is what I think is really important to understand when you see particularly young people in the West joining up to this thing, because what they're buying into is that narrative: might, power, self-determination. You are in charge, and no one can cross you. And so it's like through the performance of this ultra-violence, they're selling a dream of liberation. And I'm not putting that too highly. All you need to do is read. You've read Dabek. It's in there. You read the speeches that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, again, another Abu Bakr, but yeah. You read the speeches that he gives. The speech he gave when they proclaimed the caliphate. The language is all, to this day we have removed humiliation from you.
And do you see this as psychological for the young Westerners who, you know, the tens of thousands, not more than that, but
yeah, it's clearly an important part. I wish I knew who said this, because I only just read it last week, and you want to attribute these things, but whoever it was put it really well. They said ISIS is the biggest, baddest gang on the planet. And if that's what you're looking for, if you want to sign up to something, if you want to sign up to a gang, because it gives you identity, it gives you self-esteem, it gives you all those things. If you want to sign up to that, there's no one offering a more sort of compelling image, right? Like, it's powerful. And that's why I get really, really annoyed. That's why I began that video by saying that ISIL's weak, which I think was the bit just before you started it, but the introduction to it. That's why I began with that. Because it's true, by any conventional measure, they are weak. And their strength comes largely from symbolism. But also, strength is like the central pillar of their propaganda. That's the thing. If they're weak, they're not attractive.
Yeah.
And yet that's the truth. And yet we insist, as a public culture, of talking about them in terms that I regard as
Great
untrue
power, yeah.
and the fulfilment of their propaganda. Why we would do that, it beats me. Completely beats
something
me.
I hadn't intended to ask you, but I now intend to because of what you've just said. Does that mean that you would support, I'll give a characterization of President Obama's military policy, which is to hope that Islamic forces do the fighting on the ground, but to use the air capacity of the United States and its allies to what he calls degrade whatever the state, Islamic State.
Do I support that idea?
Do you support the Obama strategy, military strategy?
Well, I think there's no point. So my problem with the response to ISIS at the moment is there's no strategy. Right, so there is a military strategy, but a military strategy untethered to a political strategy is not a strategy. And this is the problem that we have. So that's why we're actually, if you look at what we're doing, it's just a holding pattern. We're not really even fulfilling the military strategy that you've just articulated, because it's not like there's, you know, armies of ground troops going in there trying to take out ISIS to get rid of them. And part of the reason we're not getting rid of ISIS, it's clear to me, and I've spoken to people who work in government areas who've kind of admitted this to me, the reason we're not doing it is because we're not actually ready to get rid of ISIS. Like, what happens then? Well, we just don't know. And recognising that ISIS only exists because of a power vacuum that on the Iraqi side we helped create, and on the Syrian side the Arab uprisings and Assad's response created. You create another power vacuum, you just get another thing that steps in that's probably another step worse, right? So you can't have a military strategy that's not tied to the political strategy. And if there's one thing I will say about Western governments post-Iraq is I think they have learnt some of the lessons of Iraq, and one of the lessons they learnt is that you have to do the politics before you do the military. So right now they're just working on the politics, but I don't know what that plan is. There's no clear strategy for it. I mean, get Assad to be a nice guy seems to be the strategy. I don't know.
It's tough.
It's very tough. But the idea that all you need to do is get Arab nations to send in their troops to do the messy stuff and we'll go from the
Well, I suppose what you try and do as well with the Iraqi government is to make the Shia take seriously the claim, particularly of the Sunni, but also the Kurds to form. But that's...
Well, that's the other element of ISIS creation, which I didn't go into, but which is really important, is the way that the Iraqi government completely sidelined Sunnis and discriminated against them. And I'm not making that as a sort of boo-hoo poor Sunnis point. The reason I'm saying that is in the north of the country, what that meant is a lot of the Sunnis who were facing there were death squads going around. ISIS roll into town and they go, you know what, we're not even going to fight you because we reckon you'll fight them for us.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what happened, right? That's why ISIS has never beaten anyone.
Yeah.
Because they've never had to. Yeah.
The thing that frightens me a bit about all of this is, and I think it's because I take ideology very seriously, that ideas are entering the heads of young men and women in Libya, in Nigeria,
yep.
In large parts of North Africa, as well as in the Middle East. And how do those, how does that poison become diluted or, as it were, detoxified? Do you have, I mean, is my fear of that misplaced?
No, I think your fear is very well placed. And by the way, I don't think you're wrong to take ideology seriously. I take ideology seriously, but I just understand that ideology only ever becomes active when it's connected to certain social environments. And so, I mean, Nazism as an ideology is still out there. Is it less dangerous than it was?
Yeah.
Well, the ideology isn't. What's different is the sociology connected to the ideology, right?
Well, a lesson has been learned, I think.
Yeah, possibly, yeah. Yeah, but the ideology is still... So I guess what I'm saying is ideologies as kind of abstract things don't do it. The thing that makes them active are people, and people are socially situated, so we need to understand that social situation. Anyway, that's a theoretical point, but your question about are you right to be worried about it? Yeah, I'm worried about it. And I'm worried about where this goes because what I see happening in the Middle East right now is the lack of a compelling alternative for anything. I mean, the only reason Islamism exists in the way that it currently does is because up to now, in the post-colonial era, it has offered the alternative to secular autocracy. That's kind of it. In the West, we don't really think of it that way because we think of Islamism in the same way that we think of like theocracy.
Yeah.
It's not quite the same. Like in the context of a post-colonial Middle East, that was about rediscovering identity and often resisting oppression. It's quite a different thing. It doesn't mean that when they got the reins of power, they wouldn't subsequently become oppressive. But they very rarely got the reins of power.
Yeah.
You really got the example of Iran. Even Saudi is not quite the same example because it's not that post-colonial history. So that's kind of it.
Yeah.
But so now you have this crisis in the Middle East where there's actually no overarching political idea that people will believe in.
And I know, I mean, you may not want to talk about this much, but I know you were very excited at the time of the Arab Spring, and you were talking, I remember hearing you on the radio talking about a young Egyptian who, for a moment, had sort of a great influence as a humane and liberal spirit. Is that a great shock that the Arab Spring came to so little?
Can I clarify my excitement? I was never excited in the sense that I thought this was going to be a utopia. I was excited in the way that it's always exciting because, I've got an Egyptian background and around when I was at university, I was kind of going to Egypt quite a lot, talking to my family there and just seeing the changes in society there. And, there's this horrible feeling of seeing these people constantly suppressed, but then seeing over a period of time, they were just beginning to care less and less about what the regime thought. And I distinctly remember this, came home from a trip there in 2004, and I said to anyone who would listen to me, there's going to be a revolution in Egypt. But I didn't know, I thought maybe 20, 30 years, and then it sort of happened. As it turns out, it wasn't really a revolution. But anyway, so it was just kind of exciting from that perspective, but I was always fearful. Because my sort of resistance to that sort of, the idea of a progressive utopia. That's not my philosophical position. I'm much more conservative than that, and I don't, generally speaking, like revolution as an idea. I'm a bit scared of it.
You're not a Jacobin.
I'm not a Jacobin, no. So I always felt that the Arab Spring, or the Arab Uprising is probably a better term, I always felt they had the potential to go horribly wrong. And I remember I wrote an essay in the Monthly about this, and I said the problem is, there's a great potential moment here, because what the uprisings did was they completely wrong-footed Al-Qaeda, who suddenly had nothing to say, because Al-Qaeda were sort of saying, the system's against you, it's immovable, the only way to do anything about it is through violence. And then suddenly these people go to the streets and then the president's gone. It's like, well, okay, well, you're wrong, so shut up. Right? And they did shut up for a long time. But I knew at the time, and I wrote it at the time, that we're wrong if we think what really happened here was a popular revolution, like that the people changed things. No, it was convenient for the military in Egypt, to take Egypt as the seminal example. It was convenient for the military in Egypt to get rid of Mubarak. They were happy to do it. It was really a coup that had popular support, but that was a sort of unpalatable thing to say. And when you acknowledge that that's what's happened, then you recognise the possibilities of this going horribly wrong are real. Yeah. And the essential problem with the Arab uprisings, I think, was that it was really, really clear what all the protesters wanted as far as getting rid of someone, but it was far from clear what they wanted after that. And then when the revolutionary movement in Egypt decided, we don't have a spokesperson, we don't have a leader, at that point it was all over. It was like, okay, well, you ask for nothing, because no one's allowed to ask for it, because there's no leaders. Someone else will ask, and then they'll get. And the regime's in a really good position just to revive itself. And leaving aside the interlude of the Brotherhood, which was a disaster in its own right, that's what's happened. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask one big question about Europe.
Sure. And
one big question about America, and then talk about Australia.
We can make them the same question if you want.
They're different questions.
Oh, are they? Okay.
The European question is, partly, do you take what is often called Islamophobia seriously as a force within European societies now? And I suppose the political question is whether the response to Al-Qaeda and IS, and particularly to the recent shootings in Paris and Brussels, whether you think there is a chance that Islamophobic or anti-Islamic thinking is going to turn to a new form of far-right politics in Europe. It's a big question, and we're doing this sort of, as they say, tour d'horizon. Yeah. What's your sense of how far fear or hostility to Muslims might lead to a new kind of, not fascism, but some kind of new far-right politics?
Well, it kind of already has, hasn't it?
Not yet in the capacity to take control of...
No, they haven't got control of governments. They've been in governing coalitions all across the continent. Just about every country on the continent now has a far-right movement that's doing quite well. Even now you're starting to see it in Germany, and that was the thing that scared me. Just seeing that potential existed in Germany. I was in Germany for a conference in, I don't know when this was, maybe 2011 or something. And do you remember when Sarrazin wrote that book? Do you hear about this? Or maybe I did because I was there at the time.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact time, but it was a couple of years ago.
So Sarrazin was this guy who's on the equivalent of like the Reserve Bank or something at the time. Anyway, he wrote this book. And so a German guy writes this book. And the book was saying things like, the Turks can never be German. They're resistant to integration, and they can never, they're distant. They just cannot integrate. They will not be German. And at the same time, he said, and the Jews, by the way, are really successful because they have this amazing genetic makeup that just kind of like, I don't know how you can not embrace Nazism but still embrace it. I don't know what that was. But anyway. And what was really interesting about that was all the political parties come out and say this is horrible and denounce him, and he was a member of one of the parties, and then a bunch of opinion polls started getting published that found that if he had his own political party, he would start at about 20% of the vote. And then the political party started cozying up to him again. And then you had, and this was the really scary thing, you had German Jews stand up and say, this is unacceptable. German Jews. I can't think of anyone on the planet who can speak with more authority about this. Like, if there's anyone who's going to say something about this and everyone just shuts up and goes, okay, German Jews. And they were ignored, just ignored. And I had a friend in Germany who was quite well known in Germany, but I think his role was actually as like an advisor to the prime minister of a state government, effectively. But he was quite well known. He was often discussed in the press, and so I guess his political leanings were conservative because that's who his political party was. I was talking to him about it, and he's the loveliest guy. He's one of those guys who's just always happy, and he was not happy. And he said to me, we've lost, because if this is possible in Germany, it's possible everywhere else, and we all believed that Germany would never go through this again. And he said, now we're about to. That's I would never rush to that conclusion about Germany, right? Because, you know, it's cliched to sort of evoke those spectres. But this was him.
Yes.
And I got petrified.
And if anything, since then, it's moved
got worse, right?
Because of this strange decision, I mean, wonderful in a way, decision of Angela Merkel.
Yep.
So I think I see it as the answer to the accusation against Germany, which based on the Holocaust, that we are in fact a humane nation. But from what I'm reading now, the atmosphere in Germany is shifting rather rapidly, even further in the direction you've been talking about, because
it's irrepressible, this thing across Europe, right? And there are lots of reasons for that. Like, I don't believe that it's just there's some kind of inherent, invincible continental racism that just will express itself from time to time. I mean, I do believe that racism is incurable, that it can never be eliminated, but...
You've got conservatism.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. But I don't believe it's just... The problem is that Europeans are just racists. I don't think it's as simple as that. Europe's been through a lot, and there's a huge underclass within Europe. They're sort of the losers of the last 30, 40 years of globalisation, I think, are starting to express themselves. In some ways, they've been doing that in the Middle East for a while, and slowly they're going to start doing it in Europe. Or maybe not so slowly. But the other problem I think Europe has, and I think this is it's not uniquely European, but it's not an American or an Australian problem. And this is really important for us to understand before we decide we're going to freak out in unison with Europe, is that Europe is really poorly equipped to deal with the mass influx of people from all over the world. Because the nations of Europe, and I will generalise here, the nations of Europe have national identities that are built on ethnic and linguistic and sometimes religious and racial markers. So if I say, I think the reason Germany finds it really hard to deal with the fact that there are a lot of Turks there is that if I say I am German, I'm not saying I'm a citizen of the German state. At some level, I'm saying I am Germanic. And this goes back to the treaties of Westphalia, 17th century, the idea of establishing fixed borders and the mythology that was created along with that in Europe, that each parcel of land was coherent and meaningful and surrounded a group of people that were essentially homogenous and who were essentially different from the people in the next parcel of land, right? And this was all mythology, but it was brought into being politically, and it's been brought into being over centuries. And so these are the national identities of Europe, right? Which is why minority languages, for example, have been quite assertively stamped out in France, or and minority dialects. It's why Franco was trying to create Spain when Spain is one of the most incoherent countries, in Europe. It's why you had the IRA. It's one of the reasons. You've got this mythology in Europe that says that the nation is really about a kind of ethnic homogeneity. When that's the national identity, and I'm not criticising that, by the way. That's the artefact of history. If that's your national identity. Then when you come to a point where you look out, you open your window, and that's not what the nation actually looks like, then you have a national identity crisis.
And your contrast there is with, as you said, with Australia, but the United States
and especially
is more
America. Yeah.
Especially America. But then again, if I can ask a question I was going to ask about the States, in recent times, in what I regard as a rather grotesque contest for the Republican nomination for the US presidency, there are only two candidates sort of plausibly left. One of them, Donald Trump, wants to prevent migrants, at least temporarily Muslims temporarily from migrating to the United States because they're too dangerous. And the other candidate, Ted Cruz, wants to patrol Muslim neighbourhoods because they're too dangerous to be treated as ordinary citizens.
Yep.
So this is the United States, which is not like Europe. How seriously do you take this stuff? I mean, is something also happening in America on this question of Islam and politics that is alarming?
Something's definitely happening in Republican politics.
Yeah, I suppose I'm asking, is it just Republican politics or is it beyond that?
Well, I guess what I want to say about this is I don't think that's the right way to look at America in comparison to Europe. Because America, what I'm saying about America has nothing to do with the presence or absence of racism. America's been really good at racism for a long time, right? But
arguably,
they had
better
wars
than
and stuff about
in
it.
the 19th
Like
century.
Yeah, right. There's always been that. The civil rights movement was not very long ago, right? Even today, Black Lives Matter, all that stuff. They're good at that. The miracle of America is not that they don't have racism. The miracle of America is that despite their racism, they're capable of holding a national identity that the victims of that racism still want to be attached to. That's the miracle. The most amazing thing about America, and I didn't pick this up until I went there for a sort of 3-week period and I had to meet a lot of people to talk about a lot of these issues to form this. And I happened to be there at the time Barack Obama was being inaugurated, so it was a really good time to hear America talk about America. Most times are, but this was a really good time. Anyway, one of the things that really struck me about it was the white supremacist and the African American civil rights activist can both at some point plausibly stand up and say, God bless America. Very few countries can do that. No European country can do that. In Australia, we have a similar sort of problem as Europe in that if you feel discriminated against, you're more likely to hold it against the country, the very idea of the country, than you are in America. And the reason I think that's the case is that the American identity was never an identity based in culture. Because American culture doesn't exist, right? America's really a union of about 5 or 6 countries that have nothing to do with each other. If you've travelled through America, you should. New York is not America. It's a completely different. It has a similar flag, but that's it. It's not America. But this trip I went from New York to Miami. It's totally then get this transition from Miami to Tulsa, Oklahoma. So the greatest transition in the history of domestic travel. Like Miami, it's just everyone's angling for a modelling contract, and then I go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I go into Walmart. I think I might have told you this story. I go into Walmart and I buy a camera, and the guy says to me, "Do you want the warranty?" And I say no, because I'm going back to Australia soon. And he says, "I love Australia. It's my favourite European country." And I didn't know if he thought I said Austria, or he thinks Australia's in Europe, or he's making a penetrating comment about the nature of the Australian national imaginary. I don't know, but I suspect not the latter. But anyway, he was like small town America. It was the very fulfillment of everything you think. And then I'm off to Seattle, which is counterculture, and then back to Washington, and then to New York. So all very different places. And it was amazing. You pick up, these are totally different countries. Totally different countries. I didn't even get to Texas, right? So, yeah, the Pacific West is not the West, and it's not the Midwest, and it's not the Northeast, and it's not the South, and they're very different. So what it is that keeps America together as a country or as a nation is not culture at all, but rather a civic idea. That civic idea being the idea of individual liberty. Now, you don't have to like the idea. You don't have to think it's a good idea as one on which to found a society. That's totally your choice. It brings with it a lot of weird things like the inability to do gun control and healthcare being the most controversial thing in the world. And it brings all sorts of weird stuff. And it brings lots of violence and it brings lots of inequality. But one thing it does do is it means that you can arrive in America one day and the next day completely be signed up as an American. Just, I am an American. I've got my hyphens. Everyone in America has a hyphen. African American, Irish American, Italian American, Jewish American, everything. Yeah. Everyone has a hyphen. And it works because either side of those hyphens is connoting something different. The cultural side is where you say you're Irish or whatever. That's culture. And the other side is civic, American. It's a political identity. I'm a member of this nation state. I enjoy liberty. And I will do with my liberty whatever. I will get in your face with my liberty. With my liberty, I will embrace all sorts of cultural norms you find repugnant. And that's America. Europe cannot have that conversation. You just can't. So it's very hard to be Turkish German. Well, what does that mean? Right? Yeah. And Australia is kind of in the middle of this. We have our European proclivities. So I will... if I'm talking to non-white people, they will often talk about, they'll say, this person's Australian. And what they mean by that is this person's white. That just pervades, right? I get in a cab, I'm going to be asked where I'm from. It's as simple as that. Typically because the cabbie is Indian and thinks I'm Indian and wants to know if we're from the same village. But either way, I'm going to be asked that question, right? And when I provide an answer, not to the cabbie or anyone, I say, where are you from? And I provide an answer. I say, I like Mount Waverley. Which is where I was born. It's a private hospital there. Anyway, yeah, my parents were doing really well at the time, clearly, because they could afford private health. Anyway, if I say that, then you know what the next question is, right? If I answer it that way, it's like I'm goading them to, no, but where are you really? Yeah, but where were you, like, where are you from? And I know what they're getting at. And it was brilliantly expressed by Matt O'Kine, who's a comedian who hosts, I think, The Breakfast Show on Triple J, who just said, what they really mean to ask is, why are you black? That's what they want to ask. That's a less common question in America.
Yeah.
And what that speaks to is the different kind of national identity. But we don't have the European baggage. We talk about ourselves as a multicultural country and we sort of celebrate that when we're not busy worrying about it. But like we kind of like that. But so we're in this weird middle space. But what's interesting, I'll finish on this point really quickly. If you look, and I'm not saying this is a comprehensive explanation, but if you look at the rates per capita of radicalisation, Australia sits somewhere between Europe and America. And America has very low rates when you consider that it's like the beast. Like if what this was pure ideology and you're just reading Al-Qaeda and ISIS propaganda and going, who am I meant to hate here? America will be at the top of that list. Well ahead of France. But it produces, per capita, very few radicals.
Now, I want to ask a really tough question. I've asked only easy ones so far.
Okay.
Which is how you read the thing that happened at the MCG on the weekend, where
I missed it because I was in the president's function, Robert.
There was a game between a club that I think you care a little about, Richmond and Collingwood. And up the back, some Collingwood supporters had placed, what was it, no mosques in Australia.
Stop the mosque?
Stop the mosque or whatever.
That's amazing.
And instantly, the president of the Collingwood Football Club said this is outrageous. All sorts of people said this is outrageous. The AFL, which had been really slow to come in on Adam Goodes when he was being booed, was very quick to condemn. Is this a sign, do you think, that there is little potential for anti-Islamic feeling? I mean, I have a feeling that multiculturalism at that level of institutions has kind of worked. But I just wondered...
Oh, totally, yeah. The AFL is very proud of multiculturalism and runs. It's one of the weird paradoxes of, you know, the footy's not where you make political statements, but actually we make them all the time. Like multiculturalism round is a political statement. What we really mean is we don't want certain kinds of political statements. But anyway, that's a separate point. No, look, I think multiculturalism has landed really well in Australia. I think people are generally fond of it. I think institutions are generally behind it. The only ones that aren't really are like federal political ones, and that's a relic of the Howard era. And also, it seems New South Wales. New South Wales is just a weird place in some ways, you know. And, but, you know, if you look at, it's not even partisan. Like you look in Victoria, federal and state, sorry, not federal, what am I saying? State, opposition and government, both parties, whoever's in power at the time, big supporters of multiculturalism. Jeff Kennett, I think, brought multiculturalism into his office. He was the Minister of Multiculturalism, wasn't he? So, I mean, that's a fact.
And Malcolm Fraser is the sort of father of the federal movement.
And Victorian Liberal Prime Ministers tend to be people like Malcolm Fraser, and the New South Wales Liberal Party is a very different sort of a beast. So there are those sort of differences, but I think multiculturalism does land generally pretty well, and we're pretty comfortable with it. The problem we have is we keep looking at Europe, where leaders will stand up and say multiculturalism has failed, completely unaware of the irony that they've never bothered really trying it. And we will look at that and go, oh my God, it's a failure. I don't know why we think that's somehow instructive.
Are you worried about the growth of anti-Muslim feeling in Australia, to put it very simply?
Yeah. It's clearly becoming a problem. It's one that we don't pay a lot of attention to. It's one we will probably persistently ignore right up until the moment where we simply can no longer ignore it because it's not very sexy. But this has been the case for a long period of time. I remember reading articles, some article I read in The Australian, where I think the Federal Police had found some website where all these white supremacists were sitting there talking about how they wanted to go about finding a bus so they could gas all these Lebanese people. So no one here remembers that, right? If I say Sheikh Tajuddin al-Halali once compared women to cat meat, how many people remember that? Yeah, right. I'll leave it to you to judge which one's more sinister. I mean, they're both pretty sinister, but you can make your judgment about which one. But is that discrepancy deserved? Well, probably not. So we sort of will persistently ignore this sort of stuff. It's becoming a little bit more impossible to ignore because it's organised now and there's a logo and, you know, the United Patriots Front is a thing and Reclaim Australia's there. At the moment, I think we just think it's funny. I can tell you, and I should say, I kind of think it's funny. But I'm a minority within the Muslim community, I can tell you that. Muslim community, a lot of Muslims I know are worried about this. And
do you receive personally a lot of criticism as a Muslim because you've the prominent position you have in the world of entertainment, but also the world of opinion and so on?
Criticism from
Islamophobes.
Oh yeah, but like my inbox doesn't get pounded with it, I guess because they're busy forming their own Facebook groups about it or something, and you know, I have no doubt there are quite a few out there who would like to do me considerable harm, yeah. Okay. But it's not like, it's not in my face. Partly because I don't choose. If I was on Twitter, I would probably have a very different story to tell you about all that. And I know this because my wife's on Twitter, for example. She did this thing recently which got, well, for some reason that she can't understand, got quite a lot of media attention where she decided every time she got like a hate-filled tweet, she'd donate $1 to UNICEF. So anyway, I'll be passing around a hat at the end of the, because we're broke. But because it's just relentless. And these groups kind of organise and they do that sort of thing. Any public Muslim is going to get that if they're in the right spots. I'm just not in the right spots, I guess. By the way, my reason for not being on Twitter has nothing to do with that. I have a philosophical objection to the medium, but which I'm more than happy to go into at length. But I just happen not to be there.
I've looked at my watch for the first time and I'm astonished at the time.
Oh, have you gone well over? Are we off air?
No, we're not off air. But there is time for... I mean, I have to say, you've been so interesting that the time flew.
You have to.
There is question time now. Just a few questions, if that's all right. So there are roving mics, and
I might just start with one question, just for people in the audience who aren't aware, this conversation's being webcast as well. So on behalf of that audience who are watching via the web, this question is on their behalf. Waleed, just to tie a few strings together that you said, should we freak out with stuff that's happening in Europe? And you also spoke about the social strategy alongside the military strategy. And you also spoke about being frightened about things. What worries you? You know, what could happen, what might happen, what worries you about the situation in Australia?
My worry for Australia is that we're not very experienced at dealing with trauma as a nation. We're kind of, a sort of domestic trauma, I mean. So we tend to deny trauma, or we tend to react really viscerally to it. And I think if a major terrorist attack happened in Australia, I don't know if we would cope. It was really interesting. When Brussels happened, I was in the UK that day. I was about to leave to come home, actually. And it was just the response. I was listening to talkback commercial radio, and the tone was just so matter of fact. Extraordinary. I could never... And then all the British papers, oh, not all of them, like papers like The Guardian started writing about how annoyed they were that everyone in Britain was overreacting. And I'm like, well, really? It felt like no one was overreacting. That's the difference. And I think because we don't have much of this, we don't really know how to respond very well to it. So I'm worried, obviously, from the security point of view about the possibility of a terrorist attack. And I think that, we've already had them. They've just been very minor. But that's a real possibility and therefore a real worry. But the real thing that hurts a society, terrorist attacks hurt the people caught up in them. But the thing that actually hurts a society is the echo of that. And I'm worried that we might be a bit of a reverberation chamber, when something like that happens. I'm not sure we'll hold it together very well. Yeah.
Thanks for the conversation. And one of the themes that seems to run through it is this ease we have in agreeing on what we don't want, but the difficulty on agreeing on what we do want, which you referred to with the situation in ISIS. How do we find a scenario that we might then have an action strategy for getting towards? We haven't agreed on what that is. And I think this runs through the broader themes about multiculturalism. You could apply the same thing to climate change in a sense. We know we don't want it, but we haven't really agreed on what the solution should be. And this points to a failure of our political process. And so I want to, challenge you here to say, well, how do we combat this failure of politics? What is it that we need to do in order to have a more productive conversation that gets us to a place of agreeing what we do want? The only kind of successful answer to that question that you've pointed to is the American one, where people over there have agreed that they want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yet we here agreed that we want gun control, so we've got a problem with that. So how do we have improve our political process to go after this agreement that we need to find as to what we do want?
I'm not sure it's about the political process. This will come across as a kind of fashionably cynical thing to say. I don't mean it that way. I think Australia tends to do its best work where politicians are not involved. I didn't mean it that way. I actually respect politicians. I think they have a very difficult job to do. They're balancing impossible tensions. I have a friend who does research into expectations of politicians. He's told me about focus groups where they demand exact opposite things. Like the same person will demand exact opposite things and then complain bitterly when it's not met. Right? We want them to be professional and amateur. Okay, great. So I'm not trying to be in that camp, but I just think Australia, I don't think Australia can just overnight turn itself into America with respect to its national identity and its problems are solved. I don't think we should either. But what I would say is Australia does have certain natural advantages. We're a young nation, right? We're not a young country, but we're a young nation. We're a young political formation. We therefore have a malleable mythology. And to some extent, the evidence of that is that it's been changing. When you stop and think about it, the fact that we went from white Australia to whatever the hell you call this in the space of, well, how long has it been? 40 years?
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing, right? And it's only possible, I think, because we don't really know who we are. So things will rock up and we'll just go, oh, yeah, sure. And then try to deal with it later, right? Whereas Europe doesn't have that luxury because Europe immediately, we know who we are and we're not that, right? America knows who it is, and at the moment, its national identity works for globalisation, right? Only at the identity level, not necessarily at the social level, but that's not to say it would work forever. We are malleable, so I think it's just about, I guess what I'm saying is we are in a position to stumble upon, because we certainly wouldn't do it deliberately, we would stumble upon a version of Australianness that is broad enough to include as many people as possible. And if we can find that, then we'll probably be okay. I don't know what that is, by the way. It would be the least Australian thing in the world to know what that is. But I think that's ultimately, that's the task that's before us. And one thing that's been interesting, I think, is when you take where Australia was in the Howard era, and you look at the way our social politics was unfolding in the Howard era, it would be really hard to believe that, how many years have it been? 9 years since? So in that 9-year period, we would become, in a way, kind of effortlessly cosmopolitan. Like one of the reasons Tony Abbott was so short-lived as a Prime Minister, there are several, but one of the reasons is the sociology had completely moved on. Social attitudes had just left him in their wake. And Tony Abbott's social attitudes weren't a million miles away from John Howard's. It's just that it was 9 years later and we just evolved in this really sort of effortlessly cosmopolitan way. So we're kind of okay at doing that. The problem is we're fraying at the edges. So we're starting to see more extreme edges to our conversation that we hadn't really before. And for that, I blame, I don't know, Twitter, just because it's fun to blame Twitter.
Maybe one more question.
Promised to have Waleed out of here at 1 o'clock. We're a bit
Yeah,
past
that's
that.
all right. It was yours a promise to me. I'll take one more question. I'll give a really brief, inadequate answer and then I'll leave.
All right.
Run! I've got to go!
I'm on my way. Oh, sorry, where was it? Sorry, thank you.
Thanks. It refers to the hyphen American that you talked about earlier. And it comes from sort of my personal situation and background. So my parents were born in India. I was born in Pakistan. My children, they were born in England. And we live in Australia. So how many hyphens we're allowed, or what do we call ourselves?
This is the world, right? Like that's the problem that I'm going to get really high concept here. This is the problem that nation states are facing everywhere now, is that the people that they house are impossibly complex. Everyone's like you now, and you're the problem. Because how do you craft a national model or a national imaginary or a mythology that houses that brings all these people together? Like, who can have solidarity with that? I mean, it's just too complicated, right? And so what happens as a result of that is really apparently fringe identity and political movements have their day. Because it's really, like, a nation state can't embody all that, but some aspect of your identity will be really well embodied in some group over here, and ISIS is one of those sort of groups. Your first question was about seeing something unprecedented, and I think what's unprecedented here is not about the fact that it's terrorist groups from within a religious tradition. That's happened before, even though, and this may come as a massive surprise to a lot of people, modern terrorism has been overwhelmingly secular since it begins really in the 19th century. But what's new is that it's talking to a global audience, offering a global understanding of identity and politics and sociology. Like, that's what's new. Terrorism has always previously been anchored within territory. It's always been the IRA seeking independence from Britain within this parcel of land, or the Tamil Tigers seeking independence, or whatever it is, ETA in Spain seeking separatism, whatever it might be. It's always been anchored in territory. This is a completely new way of conceiving, where people have to think of themselves as, or are asked to think of themselves in global terms, right? So you don't belong anywhere, right? So, but if there's a global community of people who are just as weird and displaced as you, then there's a new kind of solidarity that is created there that a nation state just cannot offer. It just can't. Right, and that's one of the things that's really fascinating about the evolution of this sort of globalised radical politics. I think it's interesting. But anyway, that was a fairly dark answer to your question. I want to ask you a question. Who do you think you are? Like, what do you feel?
To be honest, I don't believe that sort of hard concreted with any culture or anything. I'm sort of generalist. I want to be attached to people, work with people, and
You don't want to be attached to everybody. Let's be honest. There are going to be people you really don't want to spend. I mean, I could probably introduce you to some very nice Klansmen who you would not want to be attached to. Really? You want to go off and?
No, I don't mean like I would go and with everyone or anyone, but I want to sort of be helpful to people.
And that's great.
We better.
But I was just about to start something here. All right.
My favourite play direction is exit arguing.
That's good.
When I, many years ago, started Ideas in Society program, now there's Bold Thinking program as well, what I had in mind as an ideal was a session like this one. I really think, as one outsider born in Australia to another outsider born in Australia, if I can say, what we've been privileged today to hear is something scholarly, eloquent, precise and interesting.
Thank you.
I'm really very grateful for a very generous hour and a half you've given us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we exit arguing? Is that right? All right.